You are about to hear something most people would dismiss as impossible. A secret buried in the soil of a remote village, one that authorities, scholars, and even the most curious historians tried to erase. 7 graves. Not just graves, but graves that refused to stay empty. Bodies were buried, their deaths recorded, their names etched on cold, unyielding stone. Yet each time dawn came, some evidence suggested the soil had shifted, the earth disturbed, and the coffins refilled. The villagers whispered in trembling tones, their voices hushed but urgent, warning outsiders that the ground itself was alive with a will that did not belong to the living. Imagine the fear that grips a man when he sees proof that the natural order, the order that has kept us alive for millennia, can be defied, manipulated, or mocked. Scholars who investigated found records that vanished almost as quickly as they were written. Diaries burned, letters shredded, official documents lost, and photographs that seemed to move subtly, as if they refused to let the camera lie. Some claimed the phenomenon was punishment. Others whispered of ancient rites, of bargains struck in darkness by men long dead but whose will persisted. And in the quiet of the night, you can almost hear the rhythm of the earth, the slow thrum of a heartbeat that is not your own, pulsing beneath the gravestones, marking the passage of time in a language no living soul was meant to read. Those who dared to dig, to open a coffin in search of answers, never returned unchanged. Their eyes, when seen again, held a hollowness, a recognition of truths they could neither speak nor erase. And yet, the world moves on, as if the strange and the horrifying can be ignored, as if 7 graves, rebelling against the inevitability of death, were nothing more than a footnote in some forgotten archive. But they are not nothing. They are warnings. They are tests. And if you listen carefully, if you allow your mind to descend past the fear, past the instinct to flee, you might begin to see the patterns that the rest of humanity ignores, patterns of power, of control, of forces so subtle that even the most vigilant among us walk past them daily without recognizing the threads that bind the living to the unseen. The deeper you look, the more the ordinary world peels away, revealing the machinery operating in the shadows. The 7 graves were not merely a supernatural anomaly. They were a marker, a signal, a proof that unseen forces could manipulate reality itself. Every burial, every attempt to lay the bodies to rest, was a confrontation with something older than memory, older than law, older than faith. Scholars who came to investigate noted the same pattern. Each time a grave was refilled, some record of the deceased disappeared elsewhere. A missing name from census records, an erased mention in parish logs, a photograph that seemed to vanish from family albums. It was as though the act of defiance in the soil demanded compliance in every other corner of the world. Those who witnessed this phenomenon often described a sensation that was impossible to rationalize, a weight pressing on their minds, as if the truth itself was an entity, a living presence, testing the limits of perception. Some villagers swore they could hear whispers in the wind at night, words in a language half familiar, half impossible, luring the curious into the ground. And those whispers were not empty. They were instructions, warnings, riddles, but each word carried the electric sting of fear, a primal knowledge that the living are never meant to confront what lies beneath. Researchers tried to catalog, to measure, to control. Each time, the instruments failed. Thermometers spiked and froze in moments. Compasses spun without reason. Cameras captured shadows that were never there when the film was developed. It was as if the earth itself had become a living observer, aware of intrusion, capable of rewriting its own story. And this is where the danger begins, where the horror deepens. The 7 graves are not anomalies, they are teachers. They force you to question the sanctity of death, the stability of memory, the reliability of perception. They teach that reality can be bent, erased, and rewritten by powers that no human hand can contain. And yet, most men walk by these truths without noticing. Most men will never know that beneath the grass, beneath the flowers planted with love or fear, there exists a resistance to the laws of life and death, a resistance that observes, remembers, and waits. To see it, truly see it, is to step beyond ordinary fear into the realm of understanding few are prepared to endure. The 7 graves are not forgiving. They do not care for curiosity, for morality, for piety. They care only that the living recognize the subtle threads of control that govern all existence, threads that, if followed, can either protect or destroy a man. What most people fail to grasp is that the 7 graves were never just about the dead. They were about control. They were a physical manifestation of a system older than kings, older than empires, older than the very notion of law. Each time a body was buried, the soil accepted it willingly, but only to test the living, to probe the limits of fear, obedience, and understanding. There are records, fragmented, heavily censored, that suggest these graves were once part of an elaborate network, a map of influence and power that spanned generations. Families whose ancestors had been buried there often vanished from public memory, their estates quietly absorbed by strangers, their names erased from legal documents. And this was no accident. Someone, somewhere, ensured that these graves carried lessons far beyond simple superstition. Those lessons were written in terror, encoded in rituals so precise that even the slightest deviation could trigger consequences. Some witnessed, some only whispered about, others recorded in the silence that follows death. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer it became. These were mechanisms of psychological mastery, designed to teach obedience not through authority, but through a confrontation with the incomprehensible. Villagers who lived near the grave spoke of strange processions at midnight, masked figures kneeling over the fresh soil, chanting words that bent the mind. Outsiders dismissed it as folklore, but insiders, those with family blood tied to the graves, knew differently. They understood that the soil itself was a ledger of compliance, an ancient device for instilling fear and submission across generations. And the most terrifying part, the earth was patient, immortal, almost, in its ability to wait, to test, to correct. A man could live a lifetime, ignoring these patterns, until the moment he tried to exert control over them himself. And then the consequences were immediate. Death would return, but not in ways one could predict. Coffins appeared open, bodies missing, the air thick with an inexplicable pressure that weighed on the chest and mind. Scholars, too, noticed that records vanished not just locally but globally. Names erased from archives, letters burned in distant libraries, photographs lost in private collections. The 7 graves were not confined to a village, they were a signal, a mechanism, a warning to all who would dare to understand power too early. To witness them is to realize that control is not exercised openly. It is whispered through the earth, felt in the absence of evidence, understood only by those willing to look beyond the veil of comfort, beyond the illusions of security, and into the machinery that manipulates reality itself. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. By now, you must understand that the 7 graves are not anomalies, they are instruments, ancient devices designed to impose order through fear, obedience, and psychological domination. The patterns are too precise, the repetitions too deliberate, to be random. Scholars who dared trace their history uncovered fragments of documents suggesting the graves were linked to secret societies whose influence stretched across continents. These societies understood something most of humanity never will, that power is less about what can be taken and more about what can be made invisible. Every disappearance tied to the graves, every family erased from memory, every scholar who vanished with a note that said, "Do not disturb," was a lesson etched into the fabric of society itself. And the control extends beyond the physical. The graves teach the living to fear their own perception. Those who attempted to document anomalies reported seeing figures at the edge of vision, feeling pressure in empty rooms, hearing whispers that seemed to anticipate thought before it was formed. The earth, it seems, becomes a mirror of the mind, reflecting not just reality but the illusions and deceptions we carry. Those who attempt to defy it do not simply confront death, they confront the subtle architecture of influence itself. In other words, the 7 graves are a form of education, but it is brutal, unrelenting, and designed to leave permanent marks on the psyche. Some villagers claim that the soul communicates in dreams, teaching knowledge not through words but through terror, flashes of memory, visions of consequences for actions yet unmade. And these lessons are universal. Anyone who comes into contact with the graves is touched, whether they know it or not. There is a mathematical precision to how the bodies are retained, how records vanish, how perception is warped. It is as if the universe itself has been co-opted into a system of control, with the 7 graves as one of its nodes, feeding on fear, amplifying influence, and enforcing rules invisible to the uninitiated. And this is where most men stumble. They think they are observers, but in reality, they are participants. Their thoughts and behaviors subtly mold before they even realize it. To understand the graves is to understand that the greatest powers in history operate not by violence, but by shaping perception, by bending reality in ways that seem impossible, and by using fear as a silent, unyielding teacher. This is no longer a story about the dead. It is a story about the living, about the fragility of identity, and about the truths hidden in plain sight, waiting for the brave, or foolish, to uncover them now. Listen closely, because this is where the story turns from eerie observation into something far more dangerous. The 7 graves were never passive. They were active participants in a system of hidden knowledge, a network of influence that predates recorded history. Those who tried to map them, to chart their movements, discovered coded symbols etched into the soil, symbols that seemed meaningless at first, yet repeated across continents, appearing in architecture, in forgotten manuscripts, in artifacts displayed quietly in museums. These symbols were warnings, markers, and keys all at once. The villagers, the families tied to the graves, they understood instinctively. To tamper with the graves was to invite a force that does not negotiate, that does not forgive. Researchers who ignored these warnings often reported hallucinations, compulsions, a sensation that the earth itself was reaching into the mind, adjusting memories, altering perceptions, enforcing obedience. And those who sought to harness the grave's power, men of ambition, scholars hungry for discovery, quickly learned that control was an illusion. The graves did not bend to the living bent to them. Ancient records, some partially preserved, describe rituals performed under the cover of darkness, sacrifices that were symbolic yet terrifying in their precision. They spoke of the graves as living repositories of knowledge, of death as a teacher, and of fear as the most reliable instrument for shaping behavior. And here's the subtle, insidious truth. These graves were designed not to kill but to awaken a different kind of death. The death of ignorance, the collapse of illusions, the shattering of assumed control. Every burial, every return of a body, every record that vanished was part of a calculated pedagogy. A man could spend decades studying them, only to realize that the lessons were never in what he could touch or see. They were in what he feared to confront within himself. And this fear is precise, surgical in its targeting. It strips away comfort, exposes vulnerabilities, and forces the realization that much of what you believed about life, death, and power is a carefully curated illusion. Those who understand this do not speak freely. They whisper, they encode, they leave traces in corners of history no one is supposed to find. But now, you are hearing it. You are being initiated. And the deeper we go, the more you will recognize the invisible architecture of control that governs not just these graves, but the world itself. By section 15, you will be asked to commit to a symbolic phrase, twice, to seal your awareness, to mark that you have crossed into knowledge that cannot be undone. For now, feel the weight of this truth. The 7 graves do not wait. They act. They teach. And they watch. The first-hand accounts are where disbelief collapses and something colder replaces it. Men who stood at the edge of the 7 graves often described the same initial sensation, certainty, a sudden, irrational feeling that something beneath their feet was aware of them, not metaphorically, but deliberately, attentively. One account, smuggled out through a fragmented journal, describes a man watching the soil move without sound, not erupting, not collapsing, but adjusting itself, settling like a living thing correcting its posture. He wrote that in that moment he felt examined, measured, judged. Another witness claimed the graves induced memories that were not his own, images of ceremonies, kneeling figures, vows taken centuries before his birth. These were not visions fueled by imagination. They arrived complete, detailed, emotionally weighted, as if implanted. The investigators realized too late that the graves were not haunted by spirits. They were imprinted with intention. And intention, when preserved long enough, behaves like intelligence. The psychological effects were consistent and deeply disturbing. Sleep disorders, obsessive thoughts, a growing distrust of official explanations. Men who once believed systems were transparent began to see gaps everywhere. Missing pages in books, contradictions in history, silences where questions should have answers. The 7 graves did not merely frighten them. They reorganized their perception. One account describes an investigator returning home only to discover that his own family records were incomplete, names erased as if they had never existed. He was alive, yet unacknowledged by the systems designed to recognize him. This is where fear turns into comprehension. The graves demonstrate that identity itself can be negotiated, altered, diminished. The earth does not simply bury bodies. It stores obedience, dissent, memory, and erasure. and the living walk unknowingly across these archives every day. The men who came back changed were not mad. They were recalibrated. They had touched a control system that operates beneath laws, beneath institutions, beneath belief. The reason these accounts were dismissed as hysteria is simple. Acknowledging them would require admitting that the foundations of order are not as solid as they appear. That death is not passive. That memory is not secure. That power does not announce itself. The 7 graves offer no comfort, only clarity. And clarity, once earned, is heavier than fear. As you descend further, the pattern becomes undeniable. The 7 graves were never isolated incidents. They were nodes in a network of influence that stretches beyond geography, beyond the lifespan of men. Historical records, when cross-referenced with missing or censored documents, reveal an unsettling pattern. Every major upheaval, every sudden shift in authority, every disappearance of wealth or lineage can be traced back, at least symbolically, to graves that refused to remain silent. The soil itself acts as a ledger, recording transgressions, testing resolve, enforcing rules without human intermediaries. Those who dared to resist were subtly, invisibly punished. Their reputations eroded, their families destabilized, opportunities vanished without explanation. Even those who thought themselves clever enough to circumvent the system found themselves ensnared, not through overt force, but through a manipulation of perception, of circumstance, of chance itself. It is as if the graves are teaching mechanism, a brutal tutor ensuring that those who encounter them learn the proper lesson. Nothing is random. Nothing is unmonitored. Nothing escapes the web of influence designed to shape behavior and enforce obedience over centuries. And yet, for every record, for every observation, the world remains largely unaware. The common mind cannot perceive the architecture of control, cannot sense the threads that connect soil to city, death to governance, fear to compliance. The 7 graves are patient, silent, almost benevolent in their strategy. They allow the ignorant to live, to assume freedom, only to be reminded intermittently that freedom is an illusion. The psychological precision is terrifying. One witness described visiting a grave and feeling an overwhelming compulsion to leave something behind, a token, a mark, anything that acknowledged the power beneath. Those who resisted were met with subtle, escalating consequences: lost work, vanished friends, inexplicable accidents. The earth itself seemed to respond to intent, to obedience, to recognition, bending outcomes to enforce lessons without anyone outside the immediate circle noticing. And in the silence of night, the observer begins to understand the ultimate truth. The 7 graves are not about death, they are about the living, about power, about control that operates invisibly, omnipresent, inexorable. To witness them, to recognize their patterns, is to confront a reality that most cannot accept, that society, law, and morality are only the surface. Beneath lies a system older than civilization itself, a system encoded into the ith, into memory, into the very mechanisms that govern thought. And once you perceive it, once you see the silent machinery operating in plain sight, you cannot ignore it. You are changed. You are marked. You are awakened. What most outsiders fail to grasp is that the 7 graves communicate, not through sound or sight, but through subtle influence, a form of language older than words. Those who lived near them described a compulsion, a pressure that seemed to guide decisions, alter priorities, and shape thought without leaving a trace. It was as if the earth itself were whispering instructions into the unconscious mind, teaching obedience and testing resolve simultaneously. Early explorers of the site reported strange occurrences, tools misplaced with uncanny precision, documents appearing in locations they had never been left, shadows that mirrored movement before it happened. These were not coincidences. They were tests, signals, lessons encoded into the environment itself. And then came the rituals. The villagers insisted that offerings be left at specific intervals, that prayers be spoken in a language they no longer remembered but could feel. Scholars dismissed this as superstition, yet those who ignored the warnings were the first to experience mental strain, insomnia, vivid nightmares, paranoia, and an inescapable sense that every action was observed and measured. Some visitors reported visions of figures kneeling, not alive, not dead, but existing as intent, as memory, as guardians of the lessons embedded in the soil. And when the graves refilled, it was never just a return of a body. It was an enactment, a demonstration that the cycle of observation and correction was ongoing, eternal, and precise. The psychological weight is almost unbearable. It forces recognition of truths that humanity has collectively refused to see, that perception is malleable, that control can exist invisibly, that power is not in domination but in shaping reality before the subject is aware it exists. Men who encountered the graves often found themselves changing habits, abandoning plans, reconsidering allegiances, sometimes without realizing why. Their minds were being aligned with a system older and more patient than any law, any king, any authority they had ever known. And the more they resisted, the more the graves seemed to respond, subtle nudges, minor coincidences escalating into undeniable proof that the earth, the soil, the graves themselves, were active participants in enforcing compliance and teaching awareness. The 7 graves are not passive. They are active, deliberate, almost conscious. To witness them is to understand that reality is negotiable, that perception is a battleground, and that fear, when wielded correctly, is not destruction, it is transformation. And transformation, once set in motion, cannot be undone as the historical trail deepens, something unsettling emerges. The 7 graves appear precisely at moments when order is threatened. Not after chaos, but before it. Records, fragmented and deliberately obscured, show their presence during periods when populations questioned authority, when belief systems began to fracture, when men started asking the wrong questions. Each time, the same sequence followed. Fear, disappearance, compliance. The graves function not as reactions, but as preventative measures, a psychological firewall embedded into society itself. And those who understood this did not oppose it openly. They vanished quietly. Entire manuscripts disappeared from monasteries. Libraries suffered accidental fires. Archivists revised dates, removed names, softened language. History was not rewritten violently. It was edited, selectively, with surgical precision. The 7 graves did not need armies. They needed silence. Those nearest to the truth reported a sensation of narrowing options, as if reality itself was guiding them away from resistance. Opportunities evaporated. Alliances collapsed. Even personal resolve seemed to weaken, replaced by an unshakable sense that opposition was futile. This is the true genius of the system. It does not punish rebellion. It prevents it from forming. And once you recognize that pattern, modern power structures begin to look disturbingly familiar. Institutions today rely on the same mechanisms: fear without visible threat, control without visible controllers, obedience framed as normality. The 7 graves simply perfected this approach centuries earlier. They taught that the greatest authority is the one no one believes exists. Witnesses described the soil as unnaturally compact after each refilling, as if the earth itself had finalized a decision. Investigators noted missing bodies elsewhere, suggesting a transfer rather than a resurrection. Death was being relocated, reallocated, used strategically. This was not mysticism, it was methodology. An understanding of psychology so advanced it masqueraded as the supernatural. Men who uncovered this truth often broke down not from terror, but from comprehension. They saw the architecture beneath society, the invisible scaffolding holding belief, behavior, and obedience in place. And once seen, it could not be forgotten. The 7 graves were not anomalies. They were instruments, and they were never meant to be found by the unprepared. By now, the weight of understanding begins to press inward. The 7 graves were more than instruments of influence. They were repositories of intent, storing not only the dead but the accumulated will of generations who had wielded control from the shadows. Observers noted that the soil seemed to remember who approached, whose lineage mattered, whose curiosity threatened the system. One historian documented a chilling phenomenon. Names written near the graves would fade from ink before the page dried, only to reappear decades later in unrelated documents, perfectly preserved. The graves were not passive. They were active participants in the preservation and manipulation of power, acting as guardians of secrets too dangerous to expose openly. Those who attempted to harness their significance reported immediate cognitive effects, obsessive compulsions, intrusive thoughts, moments of déjà vu that carried warnings in cryptic forms. And these were not isolated incidents. Letters and diaries reveal a consistent pattern of influence, the living bending to the will of forces they could not see, felt only as pressure, as weight, as an invisible hand guiding choices. Entire families reported subtle shifts in behavior, moral compromises, and inexplicable loyalty or fear, all seemingly triggered by proximity to the graves. It is as though the earth itself has been weaponized, not with violence, but with psychology, with memory, with anticipation. Scholars try to explain it scientifically, attributing phenomena to gas, seismic activity, or mass hysteria. But those explanations fail to account for the precision, for the intentionality, for the repetition spanning centuries. Here is the unnerving truth. The 7 graves operate according to laws unknown to the living, enforcing obedience, shaping perception, and bending reality in ways humans cannot fully measure. And the more one resists, the more the graves respond, subtly escalating influence until adaptation occurs or sanity falters. This is why history has been selectively edited, why anomalies are dismissed, why some truths remain buried. The 7 graves do not kill merely to punish. They instruct, they condition, they enforce the continuity of influence across generations. And if you are hearing this, if you are following the descent into understanding, you must accept a brutal reality. You are now in the territory of knowledge that changes perception irreversibly. The soil beneath the graves may be thousands of miles away from you, but its lessons, its influence, its design are universal. To ignore it is impossible. To resist it is dangerous. And to understand it is to step beyond the ordinary boundaries of fear and into a domain where power, control, and knowledge intertwine in ways most men will never survive mentally, let alone comprehend fully. The manipulation extends beyond individual minds. It reaches communities, institutions, and the very fabric of society. The 7 graves, while physically isolated, exerted influence over patterns of behavior, belief, and compliance far beyond their location. Villages aligned themselves unknowingly to rhythms dictated by the graves. Who married whom? Who rose to positions of influence? Who disappeared quietly without record? Scholars studying demographic records noticed anomalies too precise to be coincidental. Entire families erased from census logs, property transferred with no legal trace, key figures in local governance vanishing inexplicably. These were not mistakes. They were the silent work of the graves enforcing an invisible order. Those who questioned it faced subtle consequences. Career opportunities evaporated, alliances dissolved, and social standing eroded without cause. Even outsiders, unaware of the grave's existence, became entangled in these patterns. Business ventures failed inexplicably. Travel plans thwarted by accidents. Letters lost or intercepted. It is as if the earth itself had a memory, a network of cause and effect designed to maintain equilibrium in line with the grave's intent. Witnesses reported that during certain nights, the soil seemed to pulse underfoot, a tactile sensation of awareness, marking those present, imprinting lessons on perception and instinct. The message was clear: authority is not always visible, and compliance is often shaped without explicit threat. Entire generations grew up under these conditions, learning fear, obedience, and reverence for unseen forces without naming them. And those who attempted to document the influence found their work mysteriously inaccessible. Libraries quarantined manuscripts, archives misfiled documents, and letters disappeared from private collections. The pattern becomes chilling when viewed historically. The graves acted as a stabilizing agent, correcting deviations in social structure through subtle pressure, psychic suggestion, and the slow application of consequence. Men who studied this effect described a creeping awareness that reality itself could be guided without intervention, that patterns of life could be bent by observation, anticipation, and the patient accumulation of influence. The 7 graves teach a fundamental truth about power. It does not require force to dominate. It only requires control over perception, memory, and the unconscious choices of men. And the more aware you become of these patterns, the more you realize that society, history, and even personal destiny may be shaped by invisible mechanisms that operate beneath notice, quietly correcting, quietly enforcing, quietly teaching. 2. Recognize this is to awaken into a world that appears normal but is anything but ordinary, a world defined by systems you cannot see, yet cannot ignore. The rituals are where theory becomes tangible, where the grave's influence shifts from subtle pressure to deliberate engagement. Villages and descendants of those originally tied to the graves describe procedures that were precise, methodical, and psychologically binding. Tokens were left, inscriptions etched, sequences of gestures repeated with exact timing. Outsiders dismissed them as superstition, yet those who ignored instructions often experienced immediate consequences, inexplicable malaise, a sudden collapse of personal relationships, or accidents that defied logic. The graves were not merely passive, they were interactive, responding to acknowledgement, obedience, and intent. Observers reported a sensation of being weighed, measured, and classified as they participated. One account describes a man kneeling beside a freshly filled grave and feeling an unrelenting mental pressure, as if the soil itself were probing every memory, every fear, every ambition, and silently deciding whether he was worthy to proceed. Another describes hearing whispers in languages he did not know, yet understood, conveying instructions without words, demanding recognition of truths older than recorded history. And when the ritual was completed correctly, a palpable shift occurred. The air felt lighter, the ground steadier, the observer marked by a sense of inclusion, a recognition that he had passed a test older than kingdoms. But this knowledge was double-edged. To participate was to awaken, to perceive the patterns of influence, the hidden currents of control that permeate human existence. And to awaken is dangerous. Scholars who documented these interactions noted the same outcomes across decades. Lives altered, habits changed, perspective shifted irreversibly. Families and communities adjusted subconsciously, conforming to the unspoken rules encoded into the graves. The lessons were encoded into perception, reinforced by repetition, and sustained by fear, obedience, and awe. The graves taught that control does not require brute force. It requires recognition, submission, and alignment with a system whose rules are older and subtler than any mortal law. And yet, the gravest lesson, the one that escapes most, is that the living are now participants. Each act, each observation, each ritual becomes a thread in a web that spans time, memory, and influence. Those who encounter the 7 graves cannot walk away unchanged. They carry the weight of knowledge, the burden of awareness, and the subtle shift in behavior the graves demand. This is why the graves endure, why they refill, and why they remain incomprehensible to those unprepared to see them. The true power of the 7 graves lies not in the physical, but in the shaping of destiny itself. Observers soon realized that proximity to the graves altered more than immediate behavior. It influenced long-term choices, subtly redirecting ambition, loyalty, and even morality. Men who approached the grave seeking knowledge found themselves acting differently in unrelated situations, negotiating deals more cautiously, abandoning plans that had once seemed inevitable, avoiding confrontations they would previously have welcomed. Entire families, when traced through generations, revealed patterns of compliance and adaptation that could not be explained by culture or chance. The grave's influence was a form of soft dominion, invisible yet unyielding. Scholars noted that those who resisted consciously were often met with compounding pressure. Accidents, miscommunications, loss of social standing, or sudden illness, always timed precisely to reinforce lessons in obedience and alignment. And this influence extended beyond those immediately present. Communities adapted as if guided by an invisible hand, correcting deviations in alignment, repairing fractures in social cohesion, enforcing a system of order that had no formal authority yet operated flawlessly. The graves themselves acted as nodes in a subtle network, connecting perception, memory, and consequence, recording failures and successes, and ensuring that the cycles of influence persisted. Men who began to map these effects realized the unnerving truth. Reality itself could be directed, not by brute force, but through careful manipulation of fear, expectation, and awareness. Even time seemed pliable. Events that were supposed to be independent seemed interlinked, influenced by decisions made generations earlier, or by observations recorded in soil centuries past. And those who understood this became quietly powerful, not through recognition or acclaim, but by perceiving the invisible rules, bending outcomes without overt action, and surviving where others failed. But the cost is enormous. Awareness brings a burden of responsibility, a consciousness of the unseen forces that govern life. The graves demand recognition and adaptation. They demand that the living acknowledge the invisible architecture of power, memory, and control. To see this is to cross a threshold, to step into a world where perception and reality are intertwined, where every action is monitored, every decision measured, and every deviation corrected in ways both subtle and unrelenting. And for those who listen closely, who allow the truth to seep into understanding, the 7 graves reveal one final lesson. Nothing is random, nothing is secure, and reality itself is a malleable instrument in the hands of systems far older and more precise than the men who walk the earth above them. The moment of confrontation with the seven graves is where disbelief dissolves into dread. Observers who witnessed the refilling phenomenon describe a horror that cannot be overstated. Coffins, freshly lowered into the soil, rising again, sealed, rearranged, sometimes even emptied only to be returned within hours. The mechanics were impossible, yet undeniable. Some men tried to rationalize it as trickery, illusions, or the work of the living, but careful examination proved otherwise. No human interference could explain the precise movements, the timing, or the way records tied to the graves would vanish simultaneously. The psychological impact is profound. Witnesses report a sense of futility, of being measured and corrected by an intelligence that operates below sight, beyond sound, and outside any conventional understanding of time and space. One scholar noted the uncanny experience of returning to a grave he had personally documented. Not only had the body returned, but his own notes had shifted, margins altered, ink faded, as if the documentation itself had been judged and corrected. And it is here that the pattern becomes terrifyingly clear. The seven graves are not passive containers of the dead. They are active participants in a system designed to enforce awareness, obedience, and comprehension of forces far older than human law or morality. The returning bodies are symbolic, yes, but they are also functional. Each act reinforces the invisible order, reminding observers that actions have consequences beyond immediate perception. The mind reacts before logic can catch up. The observer experiences vertigo, a knowing certainty that the ground itself is alive with intent. Dreams become fraught with imagery of kneeling figures, shifting soil, and eyes watching from beneath the coffins. The effect is cumulative. Repeated exposure amplifies compliance, sharpens awareness, and breaks down the illusion of autonomy. And yet, this is not cruelty. It is education on the deepest, most brutal level. The seven graves teach through fear, through confrontation, through the undeniable evidence that reality is not fixed, that death is negotiable, and that perception itself can be reshaped. To witness a body returning is to understand that the system observes, judges, and corrects. And once this is internalized, a man can never again walk through the world assuming control is his own. The lessons sink into the mind, irreversibly altering the way he perceives history, society, and even his own decisions. This is the moment when ordinary curiosity becomes a lifelong awareness, a recognition that invisible forces govern more than life. They govern thought, choice, and memory itself. By this point, the psychological weight of the seven graves begins to crystallize. Those who observe them too closely report a creeping sense that nothing is accidental, that every event, every interaction, every memory is filtered through the unseen system the graves represent. Families vanish, documents shift, names disappear from records, and yet the observer alone retains awareness. It is a brutal lesson. Perception matters more than physical reality. The graves enforce compliance not through force, but through anticipation, correction, and subtle rewiring of choice. And here, the symbolic power of the graves becomes undeniable. Repetition is central. Each burial, each return, each vanished record is a reinforcement of invisible authority. Observers often report an irresistible compulsion to mark the soil, to leave a token, a signature, anything to acknowledge recognition of the system. Those who resist experience escalating consequences, accidents, miscommunications, social fractures, all perfectly timed to teach alignment. And now, for those listening, there's a moment of initiation, a chance to participate consciously in this system of awareness. Twice, you must commit a phrase to memory, a symbolic acknowledgement that you recognize the threads of influence that shape perception, identity, and reality itself. Repeat it silently. I see what lies beneath, and I carry its weight. Repeat it again. I see what lies beneath, and I carry its weight. This is not superstition. This is alignment. By acknowledging the symbolic phrase, you are engaging with the invisible currents the seven graves enforce, marking yourself as someone awake to the hidden architecture of power. Those who do not engage remain observers. Those who do begin the slow process of transformation, of understanding the precision, intelligence, and relentlessness of the system. Awareness is not free. Knowledge exacts a cost. The graves teach that reality bends in response to recognition, and that submission to understanding, whether voluntary or enforced, is the only path to surviving the forces they embody. And once this is internalized, the descent continues, deeper and darker, into the very mechanics of fear, obedience, and memory manipulation encoded into soil, society, and perception itself. What you are experiencing now is more than a story. It is a confrontation with patterns that have shaped humanity for centuries. Those patterns are relentless, patient, and meticulous, and once recognized, they cannot be ignored. The seven graves do not exist in isolation. They are connected to systems of influence that predate empires, dynasties, and organized religion. Historical fragments hint at clandestine societies, orders whose members understood that control is maintained not through brute force, but through manipulation of memory, perception, and obedience. These groups revered the graves as instruments of education and enforcement, tools that ensured loyalty, tested courage, and filtered ambition. Initiates were brought to the graves not to witness the dead, but to witness the principle that reality could be bent, outcomes could be directed, and even death itself could be leveraged as an instrument of influence. Records, often burned or censored, suggest that these societies meticulously documented interactions with the graves, who observed, who resisted, who survived psychologically, and who succumbed. They encoded this knowledge into symbols, rituals, and oral instruction designed to survive even when written evidence vanished. And the effect on those who encountered the graves was undeniable. Witnesses reported compulsion to act in alignment with invisible rules, subtle shifts in morality, behavior, and decision-making. Entire communities were indirectly molded by proximity to these nodes of power. Those who strayed were quietly corrected, wealth evaporated, alliances fractured, reputations tarnished, often without visible cause. It was a system of influence invisible to outsiders, precise, patient, and unrelenting. The graves taught that power is most potent when unseen, when operating beneath awareness, and when it enforces obedience through anticipation rather than force. And the lessons were cumulative. Each generation, each observer, each ritual strengthened the system. Men who understood this could manipulate minor events to their advantage, aligning themselves with the currents of influence, but only if they had first recognized the architecture of control encoded in soil, memory, and perception. The psychological imprint was unavoidable. Once a person witnessed the graves and survived the initial terror, the recognition of these systems became permanent. You begin to see connections everywhere, to understand patterns that others dismiss as coincidence, to perceive the architecture of influence shaping life, history, and society. And the deeper you descend, the more you realize that the seven graves are not just about the dead. They are about the living, about power, about obedience, and about the invisible systems that govern the world quietly, relentlessly, and with surgical precision. The grave's influence is not confined to space. It extends through time. Records and accounts suggest that the seven graves actively manipulate memory across generations, selectively erasing, distorting, or preserving information to enforce continuity of obedience and perception. Families connected to the graves often report gaps in ancestral knowledge, missing names, or histories that cannot be corroborated. Even photographs and personal artifacts are affected. Images fade, inscriptions vanish, documents are lost without trace. Scholars who attempted to reconstruct lineage discovered that timelines became unreliable, events shifted subtly, and records contradicted themselves in ways too precise to be accidental. The psychological impact is staggering. Imagine living in a world where your history is mutable, where the truth of your existence can be questioned at any moment, where the past itself becomes a tool of control. Witnesses often report a creeping sense of vertigo, a destabilization of identity, as if the earth beneath them is reminding them of their own fragility. And it is not merely memory of individuals that is altered. Communities, villages, even cities aligned themselves unknowingly with patterns dictated by the graves, adjusting social norms, loyalties, and behaviors to match invisible rules. Those who attempted to resist these shifts found themselves subtly corrected. Friendships dissolved, opportunities vanished, health declined, and perception warped. The seven graves, it seems, operate as a living archive of intent, encoding obedience and compliance directly into human cognition. The psychological programming is precise, cumulative, and invisible, enforced by repetition, symbolic interaction, and the occasional terrifying spectacle of the graves refilling themselves. And here is the cruel paradox. Awareness of the manipulation does not free you from it. Rather, it binds you more tightly, because knowledge makes compliance conscious. Once you perceive the system, your decisions are informed by understanding, but also by fear, anticipation, and recognition of patterns too vast to control. To live with awareness is to be marked, to carry the burden of knowing that your history, your community, and even your perception of reality are subject to forces operating in shadows, beneath the soil, and beyond the reach of ordinary law. The 7 graves are not passive. They are archivists, teachers, and enforcers, shaping memory and identity across generations, proving that control is most potent when invisible, subtle, and eternal. For those who dared to disturb the graves, the consequences were immediate, visceral, and unavoidable. Accounts describe an overwhelming sensation of presence, a pressure that pressed against the mind as if the soil itself were alive with intent. The air thickened, sounds dulled, and shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, converging on the observer. Tools used to dig or pry the coffins became almost impossible to control, hands shaking with unreasoning force. One witness reported that as he lifted the lid of a coffin, the ground beneath him vibrated subtly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and a wave of nausea and vertigo overtook him. Others describe hearing whispers, not in the conventional sense, but directly in the mind, instructions, admonishments, and warnings that could not be ignored. Resistance was futile. The graves did not punish overtly. They enforced correction with precision, reshaping perception, decision-making, and emotional response. Sleep became fragmented, dreams filled with imagery of kneeling figures, shifting soil, and subtle corrections applied to actions in waking life. Investigators quickly realized that the soil itself functioned as both judge and teacher. It monitored intent, recorded deviation, and applied adjustments that ensured alignment with its unspoken rules. Attempts to rationalize these phenomena scientifically, blaming gas, seismic activity, or psychological suggestion, collapsed under scrutiny. The effects were too precise, too targeted, too consistent across decades and across generations, and the terror is compounded by the knowledge that these corrections occur without visibility. Neighbors, authorities, and outsiders rarely notice. The lessons are applied quietly, subtly, in ways that reshape life over months, years, and decades. Those who survive these confrontations are forever altered. Habits, decisions, allegiances, and even perception of self are shifted permanently. The graves demand acknowledgement, recognition, and alignment. To ignore them is to invite escalating consequence. To understand them is to bear the burden of awareness. And yet, there is no escape, only adaptation. Those who leave the village may carry the influence with them, their choices guided invisibly by forces they cannot fully name, forces that have existed for centuries and will persist long after they are gone. This is the ultimate lesson of the 7 graves. Power is most effective when silent, patience is most potent when invisible, and fear becomes a tool not of destruction, but of permanent transformation. The 7 graves operate not only on the individual level but across the structures of society itself. Their influence seeps into hierarchies, institutions, and networks of power, shaping obedience and compliance long before any overt authority is applied. Historical analysis reveals a subtle pattern. Positions of influence often shift in alignment with those who acknowledge, consciously or unconsciously, the lessons of the graves. Wealth, reputation, and opportunity appear and vanish with terrifying precision, as though the soil itself orchestrates the movements of those above it. Witnesses noted that attempts to rise outside these invisible currents met with inexplicable resistance, failed enterprises, miscommunication, betrayal, and accidents that seemed almost purposeful. Conversely, those who aligned themselves, who understood the architecture of influence, found doors opening quietly, without fanfare, as if recognition of the system granted favor. The mechanism is both patient and meticulous. It does not rush. It observes, calculates, and intervenes only when deviation threatens the order it enforces. And it is nearly impossible to trace. Scholars studying anomalies often encountered missing or altered records, documents deliberately destroyed, or narratives subtly rewritten to remove evidence. The graves enforce lessons invisibly, encoding obedience into perception, memory, and social behavior. Even communities unconnected to the original site appear to align with patterns dictated centuries prior, suggesting that the influence radiates outward through networks of lineage, geography, and social interaction. The effect is profound. Societies are molded by invisible hands, consequences applied precisely, and obedience cultivated without visible threat. Men who confront these patterns recognize a terrifying truth. Real power does not manifest as force, but as subtle calibration of perception, memory, and choice. The 7 graves are not simply a local anomaly. They are nodes in a network of influence that transcends generations, enforcing order in ways the majority cannot perceive. And those who witness or understand the mechanism bear a burden, knowledge that the world is far more controlled than it appears, and that resistance without comprehension is futile. To survive, to thrive, one must adapt, not openly challenge, but recognize, align, and navigate the invisible currents the graves dictate. The soil remembers, the system observes, and the lessons persist, patient, relentless, and invisible to those unwilling or unprepared to see. The 7 graves' influence extends beyond the physical and social. It reaches into consciousness itself. Observers report experiences that defy conventional understanding, a sense that thought is no longer entirely private, that memory is malleable, and that perception bends in response to unseen intelligence. Dreams become tools of instruction, nightmares deliver lessons with surgical precision, and waking decisions are subtly steered by impulses that feel external yet intimately personal. Scholars attempting to map these effects describe a form of cognitive architecture embedded in the graves, a system that encodes obedience, perception, and memory into those who interact with it. And the implications are staggering. If the graves can influence thought at this level, then human consciousness itself is not sovereign. It is terrain to be measured, shaped, and aligned by forces older, wiser, and more patient than any society will recognize. Those who experience repeated exposure often report a heightened awareness, noticing patterns in behavior, social interaction, and historical events that others overlook. Yet this awareness comes at a cost. Compulsions, obsessive attention to details, intrusive thoughts, and a constant sense of being watched become inescapable. The graves do not punish through pain. They enforce alignment through psychological calibration, shaping not only behavior but perception of self, morality, and possibility. Observers note an uncanny precision. Deviation is corrected subtly, through circumstance, memory, or social consequence. Even those who consciously resist find their actions influenced, decisions redirected, and priorities altered without explicit awareness. And this is where the metaphysical lesson becomes clear. Power is most absolute when it operates invisibly, shaping thought, perception, and identity without the subject's realization. The 7 graves act as both mirror and architect, reflecting inner fear and desire while constructing the conditions for obedience and comprehension. To encounter them is to confront the reality that consciousness is not merely an individual possession. It is a field that can be measured, molded, and, in subtle ways, controlled. Once this is understood, ordinary life changes irreversibly. Every choice, interaction, and memory carries the potential for alignment or correction. The graves teach that true influence transcends the physical world, that the architecture of control is woven into the very substrate of mind, and that to see it is to enter a domain where reality and perception are inseparable, and where knowledge carries the permanent weight of awareness. The 7 graves have long been linked to knowledge deliberately hidden from the public, archives that were destroyed, rewritten, or obscured to maintain secrecy. Scholars who stumbled upon references to these hidden repositories often experienced rapid erasure. Letters disappeared, manuscripts burned, and libraries lost entire sections without explanation. The graves themselves seemed to act as gatekeepers, enforcing a system where certain truths remain buried, sometimes literally, and the living are subtly guided away from dangerous understanding. One account describes a man discovering coded references in church records that aligned perfectly with the grave's locations. Within months, the archives he consulted were sealed, and those aware of the discovery ceased correspondence. These patterns repeat across continents, centuries, and cultures, suggesting a deliberate, coordinated effort to preserve select knowledge while erasing those who sought to expose it. The psychological pressure on investigators is immense. Attempts to reconstruct lost information trigger compulsions, obsessions, and paranoia. Some lose years to piecing together fragments, only to discover that the material itself has shifted, vanished, or transformed. The graves enforce learning through fear, repetition, and consequence, teaching that certain knowledge comes with unavoidable cost. And the lessons are not abstract. They manifest in subtle, tangible ways: miscommunications, delayed letters, misfiled documents, and even hallucinations or intrusive thoughts designed to prevent comprehension. Those who survive these encounters carry an indelible mark, a heightened awareness of what is controlled, what is forbidden, and what is deliberately hidden. The graves are not just repositories of the dead, they are custodians of forbidden information, enforcing obedience to systems that predate written history. And their reach is total. Once knowledge touches the graves, it either aligns with the invisible order or is erased. This is why so much of history appears incomplete, contradictory, or conveniently lost. The 7 graves teach that the most dangerous power is not visible, not overt. It is hidden, preserved in silence, and enforced by patience, intelligence, and inevitability. Those who encounter this truth are changed forever. Perception sharpens, fear becomes clarity, and the realization emerges that almost everything taken for granted about history, knowledge, and control is an illusion carefully maintained across time. The influence of the 7 graves extends deeply into morality, choice, and obedience, shaping behavior across generations in ways both subtle and relentless. Families connected to the graves report patterns in which ethical decisions, ambitions, and loyalties appear predetermined, as if the soil itself imposes a silent judgment on human action. Those who stray from these unseen rules experience consequences that are immediate yet invisible. Careers falter, relationships fracture, health declines, and reputations are eroded without explanation. Even those far removed from the graves feel their pull. Choices are nudged, instincts subtly corrected, and perception bent toward compliance with the invisible order. Scholars who studied these effects describe a cumulative mechanism. The graves enforce alignment through repetition, symbolism, and psychological conditioning, ensuring that deviation is corrected and compliance internalized. Obedience becomes second nature, morality shifts to mirror the patterns the graves demand, and awareness of influence becomes both a blessing and a burden. Witnesses describe moments of decision where the right course seems compelled, instinctual, and yet not entirely self-determined. The effect is disorienting. To recognize freedom of choice while simultaneously understanding that choices have already been shaped by forces beyond perception. Across generations, the graves ensure continuity of behavior, subtly guiding lineage, alliances, and social order without overt enforcement. The lessons are encoded in fear, in ritual, in symbolic acknowledgement, and in the subtle reshaping of memory. Those who attempt to resist without understanding are often corrected through misfortune, hallucinations, or social isolation. Those who recognize and adapt gain insight, awareness, and power, but at the cost of knowing the full scope of the system that manipulates life, thought, and morality. The 7 graves are not merely passive, they are instruments of governance over human will, consciousness, and ethical alignment, enforcing order through invisible architecture, patient observation, and the enduring imprint of centuries-old influence. Once you perceive this, you understand that morality, choice, and obedience are not merely personal. They are shaped, measured, and calibrated by forces older and more persistent than any law or society you know. The 7 graves do not confine their lessons to waking life. They extend into dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness, infiltrating the mind when it is most vulnerable. Witnesses report dreams that are not random, but meticulously structured, scenes of burial and return, shadows kneeling over soil, flashes of forgotten rituals, and sequences that mirror real-world events before they happen. Some describe being guided by unseen entities, neither human nor spectral, but embodiments of the grave's intent, delivering lessons in perception, obedience, and memory. These nocturnal experiences are psychologically precise. They reinforce alignment, correct deviation, and embed patterns of thought that persist upon waking. One observer wrote that he awoke knowing secrets he had never consciously learned, yet the knowledge was coupled with intense anxiety and a compulsive need to act in accordance with what he had seen. Others report that refusal to acknowledge these visions results in escalating psychological strain, restless sleep, intrusive thoughts, confusion, and even hallucinations during waking hours. The graves interact with consciousness as though it were a medium, a pliable surface that can be shaped, measured, and corrected. This extends their influence far beyond the physical location, as those who travel, spread knowledge, or attempt to resist still carry the psychic imprint, subtly guiding decisions and perception. Scholars attempting to document these phenomena encounter immediate obstacles. Notes vanish, recordings fail, and memories of encounters shift unpredictably, often aligning precisely with the lessons the graves demand. The result is a perpetual cycle of influence, reinforcing the notion that the living are participants in a system far older and more precise than any formal authority. Dreams become not just reflections of fae, but instruments of instruction, memory manipulation, and behavioral calibration. And the deeper one falls into observation and comprehension, the more impossible it becomes to ignore the truth. The seven graves operate on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, social, and psychological. To encounter them is to realize that reality, memory, morality, and perception are interwoven with forces that act invisibly yet with relentless precision, reshaping not just behavior but the architecture of consciousness itself. Repeated exposure to the seven graves transforms perception in ways that are subtle at first, then absolute. Witnesses report that ordinary events begin to carry extraordinary weight. Casual conversations hint at hidden meanings, coincidences reveal invisible patterns, and social interactions feel orchestrated by unseen hands. Men and women who lived near the graves describe a growing unease, a sensation that reality itself is pliable, that time, memory, and consequence are instruments in the grave's design. Those who attempt to resist this awareness experience escalating pressure. Relationships fray inexplicably. Plans derail without cause, and intuition becomes a battleground where instinct competes with subtle manipulation. The graves teach that compliance is not merely action, it is perception itself. Those who learn this begin to see the invisible architecture of influence in all areas of life, from social hierarchies to institutional behavior, from personal choices to the course of history. Communities subtly align themselves with the patterns enforced by the graves. Loyalty, obedience, and recognition of authority become internalized, even when no explicit enforcement exists. The psychological transformation is relentless. Fear becomes clarity, vigilance becomes instinct, and the individual begins to navigate a world that feels both familiar and unnervingly orchestrated. Observers note that once perception is recalibrated, ordinary reality appears layered. What is visible is only a fraction of the forces at work, and every interaction, decision, and event carries the imprint of systems older than recorded history. Even memory is reshaped. Past experiences are recalled not as fixed events, but as elements within a pattern designed to enforce understanding and compliance. Those who understand this gain power, but the cost is constant awareness. Freedom of thought becomes conditional, shaped by invisible calibration, and the stakes of perception are perpetual. The seven graves operate with patient precision, ensuring that repeated exposure produces alignment, insight, and a permanent recognition that life, choice, and consequence are never as autonomous as they appear. To witness this is to enter a domain where reality is no longer objective, but orchestrated, monitored, and adjusted by forces that demand acknowledgement, respect, and subtle obedience. Awareness becomes transformation, and transformation is irreversible. History records those who attempted to expose the seven graves, and their fates are a testament to the system's ruthlessness. Scholars, journalists, and local witnesses who tried to write or speak openly about the phenomena often disappeared quietly, leaving no trace beyond fragmented notes or incomplete manuscripts. Others were discredited through social or professional channels, their credibility eroded in ways that seemed disproportionate, yet precise. Some families vanished from official records entirely, leaving gaps in census data, property registers, and archives, as if their existence had been silently erased. The lessons were clear. Knowledge of the graves carries consequences, and the system ensures compliance through both psychological and social correction. Witnesses recount letters lost, research confiscated, and evidence misplaced by unknown forces. Even those who survived faced mental strain, obsessive reflection, compulsive behaviors, and subtle recalibration of morality and priorities. The grave's power is not in overt violence, but in shaping the narrative of history, the perception of truth, and the alignment of human action with the unseen order they enforce. Attempting to challenge them directly is futile. Attempting to observe without acknowledgement results in slow, cumulative correction. Those who understand this recognize a horrifying pattern. Society itself is partially curated, edited, and guided by invisible systems of control designed to preserve secrecy. And the graves are central to this structure, acting as both sentinel and arbiter, deciding who may perceive, who may survive psychologically, and who is subtly redirected or erased. The cost of awareness is permanence. Once you see the influence, You cannot unsee it, and the knowledge changes your understanding of history, power, and human behavior forever. The 7 graves do not merely contain the dead, they enforce obedience, control memory, and manipulate perception in ways that ensure their lessons persist across generations. To witness or record these truths is to confront a system far older, more intelligent, and far more patient than any human authority. And the deeper the awareness, the more apparent it becomes that what society accepts as history is only a fragment, carefully curated by forces that operate in silence, beneath notice, and beyond challenge. The 7 graves are as much symbolic as they are physical, representing cycles of observation, correction, and alignment that extend beyond soil and stone. Observers report an almost ritualistic compulsion to acknowledge them, to leave marks, tokens, or inscriptions as an act of recognition. Failure to do so results in subtle yet relentless consequences, disrupted plans, failed alliances, or mental unease that cannot be traced to any cause. The graves encode lessons in obedience, morality, and awareness into the very psyche of those who encounter them, and their cyclical nature. The repeated refilling reinforces the permanence of these lessons. Psychologists and historians who attempted to map these effects noticed that participants experience recurring dreams, obsessive thoughts, and compulsions directly tied to the grave cycles. Each refill is a reset, a recalibration, a measurement of human response. Consciousness becomes a medium through which the graves exert influence, blending fear with comprehension, compliance with knowledge, and instinct with cognition. Witnesses describe a growing recognition that every action carries meaning beyond immediate consequence, that thought itself is observed and shaped, and that deviation from the invisible rules triggers correction at multiple levels: social, psychological, and even existential. The symbolism is precise. The graves remind the living that death is not final, that cycles are eternal, and that the balance between awareness and ignorance is constantly tested. Those who comprehend this begin to perceive life as a network of invisible rules, subtle nudges, and persistent enforcement, with the graves acting as both teacher and arbiter. Even in direct exposure, through stories, lineage, or proximity, transmits lessons across time, embedding compliance and perception patterns into consciousness before the individual fully realizes it. The psychological architecture is breathtaking in its efficiency. Influence is applied silently, persistently, and universally, ensuring that the lessons of the grave survive across generations, cultures, and geography. And for those who truly internalize the patterns, reality itself begins to feel layered. What is visible is only a fraction of the forces at work, and every decision is an opportunity to recognize, adapt, or be corrected. To understand the symbolic significance is to acknowledge that the 7 graves operate beyond death, beyond society, and beyond the limitations of human perception. They are a system, eternal, intelligent, and inexorably precise. Fear is the instrument through which the 7 graves enact their most profound lessons. It is never arbitrary. It is precise, deliberate, and measured. Observers report that the sensation of approaching the graves is accompanied by an almost magnetic awareness of personal vulnerability, every insecurity, hesitation, and doubt amplified. This fear is not destructive. It is instructive, calibrating perception, forcing awareness, and compelling adaptation. Anticipation plays a crucial role. Witnesses describe a subtle tension building in the air, a sensation that events are orchestrated to test not strength, but decision-making under pressure. The graves seem to measure resilience, patience, and compliance, embedding the lessons into the subconscious through repeated exposure and consequence. Attempts to resist or rationalize the fear only deepen its effect, producing mental strain, obsessive reflection, and subtle compulsion toward acknowledgement. Those who submit, who understand the rules and align their actions with the invisible order, gain clarity, insight, and a rare form of power, the ability to perceive patterns invisible to others. Historical accounts suggest that entire communities were shaped through these mechanisms, with obedience, loyalty, and social alignment enforced not by threat of punishment but through anticipation, measured fear, and subtle correction. Repetition is central. Each refill, each ritual, each subtle adjustment in circumstance reinforces the architecture of influence, ensuring that perception, memory, and behavior converge with the lessons the graves impart. The psychological design is relentless. Deviation triggers correction, compliance strengthens awareness, and observation becomes an instrument of transformation. Men who study these effects report an unnerving truth. The seven graves teach that reality itself is responsive, that fear is a tool of comprehension, and that the mind can be calibrated without overt coercion. Once internalized, this awareness cannot be undone. It changes the way one perceives threat, authority, and even personal choice. The graves demonstrate that transformation is not granted by external force, but by the patient, precise, and inescapable shaping of thought, instinct, and awareness. To understand fear in this context is to see the invisible scaffolding of control and recognize the architecture of power operating quietly beneath the surface of every decision, interaction, and perception. The seven graves are intimately tied to identity and lineage, shaping not just the individual, but entire familial patterns across generations. Observers report that proximity to the graves imprints subtle instructions on behavior, decision-making, and loyalty that ripple outward through descendants. Families connected to the graves display uncanny consistencies, repeated behaviors, aligned ambitions, and compliance with invisible rules that defy cultural explanation. Attempts to deviate are met with consequences both immediate and long-term: career derailments, fractured relationships, financial misfortune, or psychological strain. The graves act as silent arbiters of destiny, ensuring continuity of influence across bloodlines. Scholars note that even in direct exposure, stories passed down, artifacts touched, or proximity to the grave's location, transmits lessons into consciousness, shaping perception before individuals consciously recognize it. This process reinforces social hierarchies, loyalty, and obedience, embedding patterns that persist for centuries. Witnesses describe the sensation of being measured against ancestral precedent, as if the soil itself carries the collective memory of lineage, evaluating compliance and alignment. Repetition ensures internalization. Rituals, symbolic gestures, and subtle acknowledgement reinforce the architecture of influence, teaching descendants to align instinctively with established patterns. The effect is cumulative and inescapable. Once the connection is recognized, it cannot be severed. Even those who leave the area or attempt to reject the influence carry the imprint, their perception and decisions subtly guided by forces older than memory. The seven graves teach a profound truth about power. It is not merely exercised in the present, but encoded across generations, shaping identity, morality, and action through invisible mechanisms. To understand this is to recognize that family, choice, and freedom are not wholly autonomous. They are intertwined with a system of influence so patient and precise that it survives beyond death, beyond geography, and beyond conscious comprehension. And, for those who perceive this, every decision becomes layered with meaning. Every action carries potential consequence, and every thought is a reflection of patterns far larger than individual life. The graves enforce legacy, not by law, but by psychology, memory, and the inexorable flow of invisible influence. The culmination of the seven graves' influence is nothing short of total. Control over perception, memory, and destiny converges into a system so precise it seems alive. Observers report that repeated exposure produces an acute awareness of patterns in all things: social interactions, historical events, personal decisions, even the apparent randomness of life. Every action is measured, every thought calibrated, every deviation corrected. The graves operate simultaneously on multiple levels: physical, psychological, generational, and symbolic. They enforce compliance not through visible authority, but through invisible architecture that shapes thought, morality, and instinct. Those who attempt to resist experience escalating consequences: subtle accidents, misfortune, social isolation, or internalized anxiety. Those who recognize and align gain insight and control, but at the cost of permanent awareness. Witnesses describe moments of terrifying clarity, where the flow of history, the mechanics of social order, and the architecture of influence reveal themselves in full. Time itself seems pliable. Events that appear unrelated are subtly linked, decisions of past generations ripple forward, and the individual feels both observer and participant in a system that transcends ordinary comprehension. The graves are simultaneously teacher, judge, and enforcer. Every refill, every ritual, every interaction reinforces the lessons that obedience, perception, and memory are the true instruments of power. And the knowledge is irreversible. Once a man perceives the mechanics at work, he cannot return to ignorance. Every choice becomes laid with meaning, every action a potential alignment or deviation, and every memory a tool for calibration. The 7 graves are more than historical anomalies. They are active systems of influence, timeless and precise, operating in shadows to shape reality according to patterns older than recorded history. To understand this is to acknowledge that the world is governed by forces invisible to most, and that alignment, awareness, and adaptation are the only means of survival. Those who emerge from this comprehension are changed forever, perception sharpened, fear transformed into clarity, and understanding of power made absolute. The graves enforce eternity, intelligence, and control in a single mechanism, and to witness them is to stand at the edge of comprehension, forever aware of the architecture shaping life, society, and destiny. The final revelation of the 7 graves is an inescapable truth. Life, death, memory, and perception are all instruments within a system far older and more precise than humanity can fully grasp. Every refill, every ritual, every subtle correction is part of a mechanism that teaches, tests, and enforces alignment with invisible laws. Those who have witnessed the graves and survived the psychological trials report a permanent transformation, instincts sharpened, awareness heightened, and a recognition that nothing in existence is random. The earth itself seems alive with intent, measuring, judging, and correcting in ways that operate beneath sight and beyond sound. Time, history, and society become threads woven into a vast, patient architecture of influence, where deviation is corrected with precision and compliance is cultivated imperceptibly. The lessons are cruel yet elegant. Power operates most effectively through anticipation, subtle manipulation, and the shaping of thought rather than brute force. Consciousness becomes both medium and instrument, morality becomes calibrated, and memory becomes a tool for alignment. Those who attempt to ignore this understanding feel its weight nonetheless. Every decision, every relationship, every memory carries the imprint of influence from the graves. And here lies the final, terrifying clarity. The 7 graves do not merely contain the dead. They contain the rules of existence itself, the invisible codes that govern action, choice, and consequence. Awareness is permanent, and transformation is inevitable. Once a man perceives this system, he cannot unsee it. He carries the knowledge forward, aware that history, society, and even destiny are not autonomous but guided by forces patient, precise, and eternal. The graves refill endlessly, not as a spectacle of horror, but as a ritual of instruction, a system of order, and a demonstration of absolute influence. Those who emerge from their shadow are never ordinary again. Fear becomes insight, comprehension becomes vigilance, and life itself becomes a landscape of patterns, consequences, and alignment. The 7 graves teach that true mastery begins with awareness, recognition of hidden systems, adaptation to invisible rules, and the acceptance that reality is far more malleable and far more controlled than any man can imagine. And once this knowledge takes root, it shapes every thought, every choice, and every step into a journey forever marked by the architecture of the unseen. The descent is complete, and there is no return.